Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we're going to look at Paul McCartney's first solo album, entitled McCartney. It wasn't looked on too favorably when it was first released, but now it shows it was a template for artists who wanted to create music on their own. So the album was ahead of its time. So Paul wasn't the first to come out with a solo album in the Beatles. According to psychedelicbabymag.com, John Lennon and Yoko Ono had already released 3 experimental albums: Unfinished Music No. 1, Two Virgins in 1968, Unfinished Music No. 2, Life with the Lions in 1969, and the Wedding album also in 1969. George Harrison released a soundtracked album, Wonderwall Music, in 1968, and an experimental album of electronic music, Electronic Sound, in 1969. Ringo Starr had released his cover album of jazz standards entitled Sentimental Journey in the early 1970s. All of those albums were viewed as side projects coexisting with the Beatles. Paul was considered the traitor. Everyone thought that Paul was the first to leave the band since he came out with the solo album before the release of the Beatles album, and it's shocking to find out that Ringo Starr was the first Beatle to leave the group. And Ringo left during the recording of the White Album in August 1968. And he walked out of Abbey Road 2 weeks later. I felt like I wasn't playing great, Ringo recalled in the anthology documentary. And I also felt that the other 3 were really happy and I was an outsider. There was no magic and the relationships were terrible. Starr returned, however, and the sessions resumed. The next Beatle that quit was George Harris, according to radio.co.uk. The Get Back sessions of January 1969 were especially draining for George Harrison. Once the sessions for the White Album had wrapped up the previous October, the guitarist visited Bob Dylan and the band in Woodstock and was impressed by their collaborative, communal approach to making music. Once back in London with John and Paul, he found his own songs were being overlooked in favor of their half-finished ideas submitted by the songwriting duo. Then things came to a head on the 10th of January 1969, when after an argument during the lunch break, George told the others he was leaving. Despite some barbed comments that they'd replace him with Eric Clapton, the other Beatles invited George to a summit meeting, and it was agreed that Harrison would return as long as they canceled the live concert idea and make an album instead. And John, he ended the band in September 1969 when he told the group he wanted a divorce. He shocked everyone with that statement. John was working on his solo project with the John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, and then Paul decided to do a solo work in secret, and he used the name Billy Martin. Paul realized the band was over with. Paul quits the Beatles on April the 9th, 1970. McCartney phoned John Lennon to tell him he was quitting the band, and Lennon had told the group of his own intention to leave the group back in September of '69, though by mutual agreement no announcement was made. Now McCartney, too, had decided to give it up. And during this time, Paul was in a bad way. He was without the only job he'd ever known, and he felt his future wasn't secure, and he went into a depression and started to drink. According to Wikipedia, in his book Fab, An Intimate Life of Paul McCartney, Howard Sohns writes that McCartney's exiled at High Park. This was grim for Linda. She had a 7-year-old and a baby to look after, with a husband who was depressed and drunk. She later told friends it was one of the most difficult times in her life, while Paul reflected that he might have become a rock and roll casualty at this point in his career. With Linda's encouragement, McCartney began to consider a future outside of the Beatles by writing or finishing the songs for his first solo album, McCartney. So the McCartney album was therapy for Paul. When Paul did the album, he was in a bad way. The McCartney album was good fun, Paul remembers, because I got a machine from EMI, only a 4-track, and I just had it in my living room where I lived in London at the time. And I go in for the day like Monsieur Magritte, go in and do a little bit of stuff and make something up and knock off in the evenings. It was very interesting to do, and it had a certain kind of rawness because I was breaking loose after the Beatles. During the Beatles period, I'd said to John, I think I should do an album called Paul McCartney Goes Too Far. He said, that's a great idea, man. You should do it. Of course, I never really did. I was just, well, I'll do it one day. And the Get Back documentary showed how Paul was the driving force in the band, pushing them to produce songs and injecting his ideas of how a song should be done. So I bet Paul did have a lot of fun just creating his own songs in his own way without having to justify what he was doing, and he could work at his own pace. So where did Paul create his album? Well, after the Beatles split, Paul spent 2 years on his farm in Scotland, and it was there that he was in his bad way. And then once he decided to create a solo album, he went back to London. According to Wikipedia, he started work on the album at his home in Cavendish Avenue, St. John's Wood, and the recordings were carried out on a recently delivered Stutter 4-track tape recorder without a mixing desk, and therefore without VU displays as a guide for recording the levels. So McCartney described his home recording setup as stutter, one mic, and nerve. He played all the musical instruments on the album, from acoustic and electric guitars and bass to keyboards, drums, and various percussion instruments, with Linda supplying backing vocals on some songs. On the 12th of February, McCartney took his stutter tapes to Morgan Studios in the northwest London suburb of Wellsden in order to copy all the 4-track recordings onto 8-track tape to allow for further overdubbing. Keen to maintaining secrecy about the project, McCartney worked at Morgan under the pseudonym of Billy Martin. And on the 21st of February 1970, McCartney moved to the more familiar EMI Studios, with the booking again under the name of Billy Martin. There he carried out further mixing on previously recorded material, as well as taping new selections. The solo album sounded easy, but it looks like it took a lot of effort to go to each studio to further mix the sound that Paul had in mind for his album. So what did the Beatles think about Paul's album? I couldn't find a review by Ringo on the album, but here's what George and John had to say. When asked for his opinion of the album shortly after its release, Harrison described, "Maybe I'm amazed, and that would be something as great, but the rest," he said, "just don't do much for me." Harrison added that unlike Lennon, starring himself, McCartney was probably too isolated from other musicians such that the only person he got to tell him if his song's good or bad is Linda. In a December 1970 interview with Rolling Stone editor Jan Wenner, which was republished the following year as the book Lennon Remembers, Lennon dismissed McCartney as rubbish and Engelbert Humperdinck music. The songs, The Lovely Linda, this song is very short, but it's very catchy. The song was written by Paul while he was in Scotland in 1969, and McCartney recorded the composition shortly before Christmas in December 1969 in order to test his then 4-track recorder, which he'd installed in his home studio in London. At 42 seconds, it's the shortest song on McCartney's solo catalog. The recording features him on all instruments, including what authors Chip Badger and Mark Esther term percussive hand slaps on a book, and ends with the sound of laughter. On the release in 1970, April, McCartney stated that The Lovely Linda was a trailer to the full song, which will be recorded in the future, but he's yet to complete a more completed version. The song appeared on the 2001 compilation Wingspan Hits in History. I love the flow of the song. It leaves the listener wanting more. Unfortunately, Paul never got around to completing it. The next song is That Would Be Something. This song has a feel of an Elvis Presley song or a Carl Perkins song with a bluesy feel to it, and you could tell how musical Paul is by the way he plays his instruments. It's amazing how Paul is able to play just about every instrument with ease. Next up, we have Valentine Day. This is a surprising instrumental by Paul. He was really rocking out with his electric guitar on this song, which is surprising since the title is a bit romantic sounding, but it's really cool. Next, we have Every Night. So Paul wrote this song in Greece while he was on vacation. He was having difficulties with the Beatles and unsure of his future, but it didn't let him down. That didn't let him get him down because Paul is optimistic. His line in the song, "But tonight I just want to stay in and be with you," shows how he has a new life with Linda and a family to be with, so things will be all right. Paul did lead vocal, 3 acoustic guitars, bass, drums, but the recording sounds more than those instruments. So Paul shows just how creative he is with songwriting and performing. And he has lines in the song stating, "Every day I lean on a lamppost. I'm wasting my time. Every night I lay on a pillow. I'm resting my mind." It doesn't sound like Paul ever has idle time, but the thought that you can lean on a lamppost doing nothing is a great thought to have, even if it never comes true. Next up is Hot as Sun / Glasses. I love the guitar work in this song. It reminds me something that John Lennon or George Harrison would have done. But then Paul goes to the organ sounding part of the keyboard, which is more like his style. And then things get strange with eerie sounding music floating around. But it is an interesting song. Next we have Junk. Paul wrote this song in 1968 while he was with the Beatles in India during meditation time. After the band's return from India, he recorded the song as a demo at Ken Fon's, George Harrison's home, before the sessions of the Beatles, known as the White Album, took place. And then it was ultimately passed over for inclusion on the Beatles and the Abbey Road in 1969. After the group's breakup, McCartney recorded the song for inclusion on McCartney. Someone wrote that the song was melancholy, and it is, but there's a confliction of a sign that's saying in the shop, bye, B-U-Y, bye, but the junk in the yard states why. It's a good song. Next up, Man, We Was Lonely. This is Paul in his country mute. It has that sound of rockabilly and folk. It's reminiscent of Heart of the Country. The song moves along like you're traveling in a car or a bus, just taking things as they come. And this song would have been perfect for Ringo to record. It's right up his alley. I love the line, now let me lie with my love for the time. I'm home, 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 home. The home at the end is capitalized with an exclamation mark. So this shows how Paul was happy with his wife and new family. Ooh, You is Paul in his groove with a song about a lady who dresses like one and also like a baby when she talks. So this song is more like an instrumental with the nonsensical words moving the song along. It's pretty interesting. Next up is Mama Miss America. According to Wikipedia, this song was recorded completely at McCartney's home at St. John's Wood. McCartney said in 1970, an instrumental recorded completely at home, made up as I went along, first a sequence of chords, then a melody on top. And then he later said of the song, originally it was two pieces, but they ran into each other by accident and became one. I love the bass, piano, drums, and guitar all blending so well together. And I also like it when Paul plays the drums because that's a rarity, and he's a good drummer. Of this song, I can picture him creating just like the songs he did in the documentary Let It Be. Now we have Teddy Boy, and this is a story song that Paul likes to do, and he wrote Teddy Boy during the Beatles' 1968 visit to India. In 1970, McCartney described the song as another song I started in India and completed in Scotland and London gradually. This one was recorded for the Get Back film, but later not used. It reminds me a bit of a Pete Townsend song with the guitar parts. Next is Sing Along Junk. This is the instrumental of the song Junk. It has that catchy melody. I don't know why there's another version of the song on the album, though. I guess he just loved that melody and wanted to hear it without the vocals. Maybe I'm Amazed. Everyone loves this song, and McCartney wrote the song in 1969, just before the Beatles' breakup. He credited his wife Linda with helping him through the difficult time. Although most of his debut solo album was recorded at his home in London, McCartney recorded Maybe I'm Amazed entirely in EMI's No. 2 studio in Abbey Road on the same day as he recorded every night. He played all the instruments, guitars, bass, piano, organ, and drums. So Linda had to be flattered by this love song written for her, and she does a great job with the backing vocals. I like this version as much as I do the live version from Wings Over America. Both are great performances. Paul shows he can play that guitar and that he wasn't just a bass playing guy. The last song on the album, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce it right, is called Kreen Akreen, Kreen, and then it's Akrore. So drum beats begin the song and it sounds almost jazzy. Then the next part sounds like the listener was transported to a jungle with the sound of birds. Then the drums return with some harmony sound by Paul. It's a wild way to end an album, and Paul has that music in him, the way he can play those drums. So the album McCartney gave the listener another side of McCartney, and it was probably surprised them because they were used to his more Beatle-like sounds. This showed us a Paul who could show us his creativity playing all the instruments in his songs. He showed us his country side, his mellow side, his rocking side, and his jazzy side. So the McCartney is an album ahead of its time, and I like the stripped-down instruments and seeing how a song sounds before all the effects are added in. Nowadays, it's common to hear this from different artists, but when Paul McCartney did it back in 1970, it was a rarity. So you could tell that this is just the project Paul needed to do with all the chaos he was going through with the Beatles ending and Paul feeling uncertain about his future. Luckily, he had Linda and his daughters to get him through those dark days and help him to see that he can make it on his own in the music world. So I hope everybody's been having a good day today. And if you like the video, if you could give it a thumbs up, that would be greatly appreciated. And if you could subscribe, that would be good too. So I wish everybody a good day and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.